Welcome to the first branded episode of Not All Men. First, before I get into what I wanted to talk about, I wanted to talk about the rebranding of this channel and podcast. I think for me, I am a person who is constantly consuming true crime and celebrity news and things of that sort. And I'm always having these cultural commentary sessions with myself that I wanted to put them all into a place so that my brain can maybe process what I'm seeing or what others are seeing. I want to kind of go beyond the headlines, explore intersections of masculinity, media, and justice, which is something that I feel is very poignant of this time period with the rise of the manosphere and red pill and people like Andrew Tate. I think it's important to start having these conversations, which have been happening all over the internet, but I wanted to sort of put them all, at least put all of my thoughts and feelings into a space. And that is the start of this podcast called Not All Men. Now, of course, this is not going to be a podcast bashing men. This is not going to be a podcast where I'm going to talk down to men, especially as a woman. I don't know what it's like being a man, but I think that as a woman, I can uniquely have my perspective of these particular topics. And maybe I can also like have my husband come in and we can have some of these discussions about these topics as well. But this is the first episode of Not All Men, and this episode is going to be a mini episode, more talking about the connection between masculinity and male podcasts and how some of it can be a pipeline to very white supremacist, right-wing ideals. This episode will be about when free speech crosses the line. You ever stumble upon a podcast that makes you question where the line between free speech and hate speech lies? I recently did, and what I found was less about conversation and more about radicalization. Let's talk about how Fight Podcast can become something far more dangerous. This episode is about the Jake Shields Fight Back podcast. Now, Jake Shields is a former professional MMA fighter, well respected in the world of combat sports, especially for his grappling game. He fought in major promotions like the UFC and Strikeforce, and even held championship titles. But in recent years, Shields has transitioned into being something else entirely, a podcaster and online personality who has embraced far right politics. He's become vocal on social media regarding engaging in inflammatory rhetoric and now uses his podcast, Fight Back with Jake Shields, to platform guests and ideas that veer sharply into conspiracy, misogyny, and white nationalism. So let's get into the main discussion. At first glance, Fight Back might seem like a rough-edged but standard blend of fight talk and hot takes on current events. But it quickly becomes clear that Shields is not just talking sports with this podcast. He's had guests like David Duke, a white nationalist and former KKK leader. If I mess this up, sorry. Gurman Rudolph, a known Holocaust denier. Marlon Gaines, one half of the Fresh and Fit podcast, who promotes overt misogyny and high value man ideology rooted in dominance and control. Myron is more known, especially when you're talking about the Black community. He's always that person who is preaching about respectability politics, which, if you don't know anything about respectability politics in regards to Black people, it's this idea that if you act the right way, or if you are nice, and if you walk around essentially making yourself smaller and not embracing your Blackness, then you are somewhat better, or that the white people will accept you, or you won't be harmed by the police, which is completely false. And Myron has currently, with his platform, has even spent time in chat rooms with white supremacists. In Twitter spaces, he's put himself with white supremacists. And so Myron Gaines is definitely someone who is an interesting character. And on the podcast with Jake Shields, Myron even reiterated some of those very white supremacist talking points. So it's interesting to have him on the podcast. And Jake Shields has also had on members of the Patriot Front, which is a white nationalist hate group that often tries to rebrand itself as patriotic and pro-Western values. So these interviews are not accidental. Shields isn't interrogating these guests. He's often nodding along, laughing, and giving space to share their ideas unchecked. It's kind of in the same vein of the way that Joe Rogan, when he was being called out a couple years ago, it's kind of in that same vein of they have on these controversial guests. And Joe Rogan, and I think a lot of these people who are having podcasts nowadays, believe that they just want it to be this open conversation. And I think that it's a good thing to want to have open conversations about society and about race, class, gender, sexuality. It's okay to want to have discussions about it. But I think that when you bring on someone who has ideas or ideals or a persona that is very harmful to a community, harmful to an already marginalized community, you need to have some fact checking as well as some checks and balances that check what this person is saying. And it's one thing to have someone on your podcast who maybe disagrees that pineapple should be on pizza, but it's another thing to have someone on your podcast who believes that the reason why the Black community is quote unquote behind is because of respectability and how they need to perform for whiteness. That's not necessarily a conversation that is forward thinking. It's not one that's based in fact. It's harmful. Essentially, it's harmful because it's just not true. And Jake Shields, to me, when I've heard and listened to some of his podcast, it feels like he doesn't understand that he is platforming these very harmful views. And here's the dangerous part. Podcasts like this take cues from shows like I said, the Joe Rogan Experience, mixing fighter mentality with open conversation formats. Rogan's platform created a mold, bringing on guests who say the unsayable. Throw in some sciencey sounding opinions, keep the tone casual, and let disinformation sneak in under the guise of curiosity. Someone like David Duke coming on Jake Shields' podcast and talking about Palestine, and bringing up all of these facts and figures and history and all of these things. Yes, when you are a person who doesn't know much about it or doesn't know much about David Duke or doesn't when you don't understand the history and the fact that a person like David Duke is only going to be pro-Palestine because he's a white supremacist and he clearly doesn't like Jewish people. When you are sitting there listening and you don't know the history, it can be very harmful, especially when you're mixing in interviews with other fighters like Marab Dwalishvili or Bilal Muhammad. You're mixing in interviews with fighters with these very unchecked podcasts with people who have very harmful views. It's more of like a hidden harm, masculinity, logic, and it's just like a mask of reason. Many MMA or manosphere podcasts mask hate in the language of logic, discipline, or male self-improvement. They position themselves as rational in a world full of emotional liberals or woke mob. But beneath the surface, the messaging often echoes racist, sexist, or authoritarian ideologies. These shows cultivate a sense of tribal identity. You're not just a fan, you're part of a movement, a brotherhood, and what starts as a discussion about physical strength or mental toughness slowly becomes a worldview steeped in suspicion, superiority, and resentment. So when Jake Shields says he's fighting back, you have to ask, fighting back against what? He's no longer a person who is in MMA or trains MMA, so what is he fighting back against? The answer, increasingly from episode to episode, looks like anyone who doesn't align with a narrow or hateful vision of masculinity and society. I've also, because I love to torture myself, I've also gone down a rabbit hole of just watching multiple of his interviews with people who aren't fighters. And there are times where he'll just spout some very transphobic or racist things that is all steeped in this idea that this is, if you're a real man, you would think this way, or if you're a real man, you would feel this way. But it's all just hate. Now, I want to acknowledge something important. Jake Shields has been a vocal supporter of Palestine and Palestinian people. And that's something I deeply resonate with. Free Palestine. Advocating for the freedom and dignity of Palestinians is a just and necessary cause. But here's where it gets complicated. Too often, especially online, legitimate criticism of Israel gets conflated with anti Semitism. That line gets blurred, and when it does, it becomes dangerous. Jake Shields, great support of Palestine, which I think is amazing, especially when you hear his interview with Bilal Muhammad, who is Palestinian, one of the first Palestinian UFC champions. His interview with him is actually so good. I think it's a great interview. You can hear Bilal talk about his family and what it means to be a champion, and what all of this discussion about Palestine has done for him, what it's done for his family, how it's affected his family. It's actually a really good interview. But Jake's support for Palestine could be rooted, and I do believe Jake Shields' support for Palestine is rooted in genuine care. I really, really do. But using the Palestinian struggle as a cover to spread anti Semitic ideologies, he risked turning a movement of liberation into a weapon of hate. Intentions matter, yes, but so do the people who you choose to amplify. Amplifying a voice like David Duke, who doesn't have a pure intentioned discussion about Palestinians. You have to separate that, in my opinion. You have to separate people like Bilal Muhammad and people like David Duke, because both of them, sure, want a free Palestine, but for two vastly, vastly different reasons, which I wish Jake Shields would acknowledge, but I fear he never will. As a hopeful future full-time podcaster, I get the desire to talk freely, to push back on censorship. But when you step into that role, you carry a responsibility, especially if you're bringing on guests who peddle hate. Jake Shields is not a political expert. He's not a journalist. And when you give Holocaust deniers and misogynists your microphone without research, pushback, or accountability, you're not defending free speech. You're enabling hate. And even worse, when the audience sees these views legitimized through a lens of strength or rationality, they mistake prejudice for power. They mistake hate for truth. And here's my final thoughts with all of this. We're in a moment where disinformation spreads faster than facts, where content is consumed quickly and often without context. That makes critical listening more important than ever. Free speech is vital, but it's not a blank check. And when uneducated people start leading conversations they don't understand with guests they refuse to challenge, they're not creating dialogue. They're creating echo chambers. They're also platforming people who want to spread hate. Jake Shields isn't the only one doing this, but his podcast is a case study in how easily fight culture, masculinity, and misinformation can converge, and how dangerous it becomes when we stop asking questions and start treating hate as just another point of view. So, that is my first mini episode for Not All Men. I guess it's kind of giving a feel of what I want to move forward, what I want this all to be. Like I said, I don't think that Jake Shields is a bad person. I don't think that he has hate in his heart, but I do think that you have to be careful when you are platforming certain people that are okay with harm happening to marginalized groups, especially when you were having them on your podcast with the little bit of information that you do have. And I'm not saying that every podcast needs to have like an expert sitting in the corner or something, but I do think it is important. I remember with the conversation with the Patriot Front, it was just him sitting down with them and shooting the shit. Like, he didn't say, "Oh, what is your group?" or "What is your group about?" or "How do people, you think people are misrepresenting you? How are you misrepresented? What are your true thoughts and your true values?" White supremacists, especially in the year 2025, know how to hide themselves. They know how to hide themselves. under the guise of, oh, I'm just asking questions, or oh, I just believe in traditional values, or oh, I'm not racist. I just think that we should all, be separate and live live on separate parts of the world, right? Or, oh, I'm not racist. I just, scientifically, isn't it proven that like black people are less smarter than white people? Like they know how to speak in a certain way that when you don't catch it, it seems like they're having a rational idea. But if when you are smart and educated, but we're also having this weird time where people don't want to, it's like anti-intellectualism. People don't want to do the research. They don't want to look into things. They don't want to find out for themselves. And that's the harm of it. You're thinking, oh, I'm listening to a Jake Shields podcast. He's a former fighter. He has on all of these other like big famous fighters, right? Oh, there's an episode with David Duke. Oh, there's him talking to the Patriot Front, and they're just sitting there and they're all drinking coffee and shooting the shit and having fun. Like, what? That group is so great. Like, who are they? They're not going to look into it. Be honest. So that's all I have to say for this mini episode of Not All Men. Thanks for listening to this mini episode. If you liked it or it made you think, share it, review it, and keep having the hard conversations. Make sure they're rooted in facts, though, not fear.